Thank you very much indeed for those very kind words of welcome. It really is a huge pleasure to be here, and it was no exaggeration to say that I was absolutely thrilled and delighted that this last week's meeting was postponed, not least because it gave me the opportunity to tell my office, which can't really get its head around the fact that I'm in Israel, that I was delayed in Israel because of snow. This confirms their view that there's something very much wrong with me. I'm going to talk about the themes of my book, Londonistan, and I hope you can all hear me if I speak at this level. I'm going to talk about the themes of my book, Londonistan, which was published in America in May and in Britain in June. And since then, various things have happened which have given it an extra dimension, and I'm going to reflect in what I say to you this evening some of that perspective given by the last few months. I wrote Londonistan as a warning, as I believed that Britain was very deeply in denial over the threat of radical Islamism. And despite a perceptible change in public mood in Britain over the past few months, I believe this is still the case. Many in Britain are still, in my view, blind to the nature and scale of what is being attempted by the Islamic Jihad, and also to the possibility that it might succeed principally because of this state of denial. Now, you may be wondering about this term Londonistan. Londonistan was a term of abuse coined by the French Secret Service. London, as in London, capital of Britain, Istan as a mocking reference to Afghanistan, where Al-Qaeda was training. And the French coined this to describe the fact that, in their view, Britain was turning a blind eye to the fact that it had become the principal hub of Al-Qaeda terrorism in Europe during the 1990s. A truly fantastic state of affairs, and my book is about the kind of culture in Britain that has allowed this to happen. But to me, the term Londonistan, and the reason why I called my book Londonistan, is that it doesn't just reflect something that happened in the 1990s, this phenomenon of Britain's role in Al-Qaeda terrorism per se. To me, Londonistan is also a state of mind, where people not only seek to appease, but to a large extent come to believe and absorb the ideas and assumptions, or at least many of them, of the enemy that intends to destroy them. This state of mind, Londonistanism if you like, is a state of mind that applies, in my view, not just to Britain, not just to Europe, but also to sections of America and to sections of Israel. Throughout the free world, people are refusing to face up to the reality of the jihad because, among other things, they can't bring themselves to accept what must follow, not least for their own behavior and the behavior of their society. It's so much easier to take refuge in alternative explanations, not least ones that blame themselves for their own victimization. It's much easier to blame yourself or your own government or your own society, which basically in a democracy you can change, at least in theory, than it is to identify a threat which is something which you can't easily get a handle on at all. And just as these people embrace their enemies, so they turn against their allies. In Britain, particularly, they have turned against America and Israel. They refuse to accept that we are in the throes of a holy war waged upon the Western world, in my view, for more than 25 years, with Israel, you might think, the proxy target well before that, without our even recognizing that it is a holy war, because it doesn't fit our definition of a war, which we assume is a war between states. This, in my view, is a world war being fought in many disparate theatres with many proximate and different causes, but all with one single coherent aim: to defeat Western civilization, to establish Islam as the dominant power in the world, and to restore the medieval Islamic caliphate. Looking back, it's clear to me that a key development was when Ayatollah Khomeini established his theocracy in Iran and declared his intention at that point in 1979 to wage war upon the West and to subjugate it to Islam. This was largely ignored at the time in the West. This arrival of the theocracy in Iran, looking back, we can see that, among other things, it ignited political Islamism around the world. It gave rise, in turn, to the rival Wahhabi version in Saudi Arabia, and it exported the notion of Islamic rule, the goal of Islamic rule, as a global project. At the same time that this radicalization was happening, and this radicalized a lot of British Muslims who previously had been very quiescent but saw in Iran the example of what might be achieved elsewhere. At the same time that this radicalization was happening, Britain and Europe were experiencing a mass influx of Muslims, and among others, as borders in Europe opened and the poor south of the world migrated en masse to the more prosperous north. The problem was that, unlike other immigrant groups, successive generations of Muslims have failed to integrate into Western societies and instead try to colonize their host countries, a program for Europe that was explicitly laid out by the Muslim Brotherhood more than 20 years ago, but today is unknown and ignored and even repudiated by people in the non-Muslim world who refuse to believe it. We can see the outcome. From Britain, we look across the Channel at the daily violence in the French suburbs, sanitized by the French government, but described by French police as a permanent intifada in France, in the similar violence going on in Belgium, in the murder of Theo van Gogh in the Netherlands, and the terrorization of Dutch politicians who speak out, in the global riots, kidnappings, and murders after the republication of the Danish Mohammed cartoons, and in the fact that the British Security Service is now monitoring, according to its own measurements, some 30 terrorist plots by British Muslims against the British state, with 1,600 known British Islamic terrorists, most of them British Muslims, in Britain, trying to get hold of a nuclear or dirty bomb to use against their fellow countrymen. Little of this, however, in Britain is reported, and when it is generally presented as the fault of those being terrorized. Thus, the French riots are blamed on French prejudice towards immigrants, the cartoon riots on media insensitivity towards Muslim feelings in publishing the cartoons, and recent riots in Royal Windsor, of all places, not a place hitherto commonly associated with social mayhem and deprivation and poverty and all these other things that we are led to believe cause Islamic rage. Royal Windsor, called Royal Windsor because it's where Her Majesty the Queen has one of her many houses, or palaces, as we call them in Britain. In Royal Windsor, after a Muslim owner of a dairy tried to call his dairy, which he had renamed the Medina Dairy, which might give some people a clue as to his project, he tried to turn the Medina Dairy into a mosque, and where worshippers in this unlawful mosque reportedly beat up local protesters, which caused in turn fairly major riots over a series of 4 days, riots which were hardly reported at all by the British media, and where they were reported, it was reported as white racists attacking innocent Muslims. Now, in Britain, there certainly are many innocent Muslims, as there are around the world, and there are those who are truly moderate. But this immediately poses a question. What is a moderate Muslim? In Britain, it appears that only those who openly endorse the murder of fellow Britons are not moderate. Those who endorse the murder of Israelis or coalition forces in Iraq are merely exercising resistance, and so are classified as moderate, even admirable. Worse still, there is an alarming number of Muslims in Britain whose views are not moderate by any reasonable definition, even though they may abhor violence, genuinely so. For example, opinion polls suggest that between 40 and 60% of British Muslims would like to live under Sharia law in Britain. Almost a quarter say the 7/7 suicide bombings in Britain can be justified because of the war on terror. Nearly half think 9/11 was a conspiracy between the US and Israel. 46% think the Jewish community is, quotes, in league with the Freemasons to control the media and police. And 37% think the Jewish community in Britain is a legitimate target, whatever that means, quote, as part of the ongoing struggle for justice in the Middle East. I see all this as a continuum of extremism, which acts as a conveyor belt to terror. What I mean by this is that even those on this continuum of extremism who don't support violence may endorse ideas such as hatred of the West, of Jews or Americans, or paranoid theories of victimization or grievance, and that those ideas are the drivers of terror. But the Western liberal mind refuses to accept that such ideas are extreme. This is because the iron orthodoxy of multiculturalism and minority rights holds that it is axiomatically a racist act to condemn a minority belief or value system, whatever it may say. That's why, throughout the West, the left now takes the part of those preaching hatred or murder, to which inconvenient truths it simply closes its eyes because it is being preached or taught by minorities. Britain has now, under the impact of all of this, begun to question the doctrine of multiculturalism, which it blames for segregated communities. However, segregation is not actually the issue. The 7/7 bombers, for example, British Muslims, born and raised in Britain, leading apparently exemplary lives, looking after children, disabled animals, and so on. They went to ordinary British schools and then to university, where in fact many British Muslims are radicalized. It was the 7/7 suicide bombings themselves which produced a great spike in terrorist recruitment. Because what Britain and all the other Western faint-hearts fail to grasp is that the greatest single driver of terrorism is terrorism, or to be more precise, the demoralized reaction to it. For decades, Arab and Muslim terror has been principally fueled, in my view, not by poverty, or by oppression, or by dispossession, but by the fact that it works. That's why the middle-class Hindu convert to Islam, Dhiren Barot, who was recently jailed in Britain for plotting synchronized atrocities, including the use of poison and radioactive bombs, said the reason terrorism was, in his words, an Islamic religious duty was that, quote, terror works. That's because Britain, Europe, Israel, and until 9/11 America have all responded to unending Arab and Muslim terror over several decades by seeking to understand, to accommodate, or to appease the demands behind it. The greater the terror, the greater the self-flagellation of its victims. That's why it works. Now, Britain doesn't get this at all. Unable to grasp that what is driving this onslaught is religious fanaticism, the response of Britain's political and security establishment has been to appease. It's a great British instinct. It's a great British export, appeasement. Britain's post-colonial mindset means it thinks all terrorism must be caused by discrete, specific geopolitical grievances. For example, Iraq. For example, Israel-Palestine. The way to end Islamist terror, therefore, in this view, is to end these disputes around the world. In my view, this is precisely the wrong way round. The way to end these disputes is first to end Islamist terror. But our establishment in Britain refuses to accept that this is a religious war. To do so, it says, would be to stigmatize all Muslims. But this is a complete non sequitur. Many Muslims, indeed, do not subscribe to these murderous ideas. In fact, Muslims are, I think, the most numerous victims of the jihad worldwide. But even so, we cannot begin to understand what we are all up against unless we acknowledge that it is a global war fought in the name of Islamic conquest and the subjugation of unbelievers through both violent and cultural means. However, the British government's strategy instead to combat Muslim extremism seeks to tackle its underlying causes, which it defines as its own foreign policy, discrimination and poverty. In other words, it's all Britain's fault that it keeps being bombed. So instead of challenging the paranoid and completely false grievance culture that's actually driving this terror, the government in Britain has chosen to endorse it and to appease Islamist radicalism. So, for example, now we have Sharia-compliant mortgages, we have a blind official eye turned to polygamy and to the forced marriage, in quotes, of 14-year-old girls, and the police deciding to make their intelligence available to the Muslim community before undertaking anti-terror raids. Muslim Brotherhood radicals being brought into the government as advisors on Islamist extremism, don't laugh. And on the site of the Olympic Village, the 2012 Olympics, which are going to be held in Britain, when Britain showcases itself to the world, on the site of the Olympic Village, the largest mosque in Europe is to be built, symbolizing the dominance in Britain of Islam. And this mosque is to be financed by the Tablighi Jama'at, said by French intelligence and the FBI to be the biggest recruiters to Al-Qaeda in Europe. Now, why is Britain getting all this so grievously wrong? Very briefly, it's because for decades its intelligentsia and political class have hollowed out British identity and values, creating a vacuum which is being exploited by radical Islamism. Britain has not only lost belief in itself as a nation, but European liberals in general have turned against the very idea of the nation itself. Rooted in the particulars of history, religion, law, language, tradition, and so forth, the nation is seen as the cause of all the ills in the world, from prejudice to war. Because it is particular, it excludes. Because it excludes, it is illegitimate, it is racist, it is discriminatory. That's why supranational institutions, such as the United Nations, the European Union, the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, and the international and human rights law which they have invented, are held to be more legitimate than the structures of individual democracies. Likewise, Britain's own culture has to give way to multiculturalism. Those wishing to uphold discrete and particular British national identity based on the particular values of that culture are vilified as racists. Some of them are. Most of them are not. They are instead merely democrats who want to uphold their democratic right to express their own culture, a right assumed for centuries to be just one of those things that cultures do. They want to express themselves in how they govern themselves. But instead, people in Britain are told this must be replaced by a doctrine whose key tenet is that the values of every powerless minority group must be afforded equal status to those of the majority. This is the key driver of multiculturalism. People might think multiculturalism is simply a kind of synonym for being tolerant and being nice to people of different faiths and different cultures and getting along. We should all subscribe to that. That's not in dispute, or shouldn't be in dispute. That's not multiculturalism. The core point about multiculturalism is that minority values have equal status to those of the majority. And what that means is that minority values, and I'm talking not just about Islam, I'm talking about sexual, racial, ethnic, religious minorities, that minority values are turned into a weapon against the very concept of normative majoritarian values. And so with multiculturalism, there cannot be any longer a majority culture at all. To impose such a doctrine of multiculturalism and then to vilify those who dare protest, in my view, since multiculturalism is a recipe for destroying a culture, to impose such a doctrine and to vilify those who protest is simply a recipe for national suicide. But multiculturalism has produced in particular two lethal effects. First of all, it's left all immigrants abandoned, and none more lethally so than young British Muslims. For if there is no longer an overarching culture, there is nothing into which minorities can integrate with the best will in the world. There's nothing there. And in particular, many young Muslims who are stranded between the backward Asian village life of their parents, on the one hand, and the drug, alcohol, and sex-saturated decadence that passes for Western civilization in Britain on the other, they are filled with disgust and with self-disgust if they go in for the drugs, alcohol, and sex, and thus they are vulnerable to the predatory jihadis who are recruiting in the youth clubs, in the prisons, and on campus, who promise such young Muslims self-respect and a purpose to their lives based on holy war. Second terrible effect, and worse still, multiculturalism has reversed the notions of truth and lies, victim and victimizer. The theory goes like this: since minorities can basically do no wrong because they are essentially the victims of the majority, and by this light the third world is one great minority which can do no wrong because the capitalist West has victimized it. Since minorities can do no wrong, they cannot be held responsible for wrong acts such as suicide bombings, which must instead be the fault of their victims, who are in fact their oppressors, if you can follow this argument. This key confusion, which has caused intellectual and moral paralysis in the West, plays even more lethally than this. It plays directly into the pathological Muslim victim culture, which makes dialogue with them impossible. Because Muslims genuinely believe they are under attack by the West, which is, they think, a giant conspiracy to destroy Islam. So they represent their own aggression as legitimate self-defense, and they represent the West's legitimate self-defense as aggression. This fundamental untruth, this fundamental inversion of truth and lies, which, in my view, incidentally lies at the very heart of Israel's difficulties with the Arab world, has created a dialogue of the demented. But instead of treating it as such, instead of treating it as the mad discourse that it is and refusing to play along with it, Britain regards it as an extension of its own minority rights doctrine, which routinely reverses victim and aggressor. So the untruths driving Muslim terror are merely deepened by the general discourse in Britain, particularly since the British left, which controls the nation's culture, demonizes America and Israel. The result is that the central Islamist perception of the big and little Satan, America and Israel, is actually echoed in mainstream British discourse, where anti-Americanism is now of epidemic proportions, and Israel is well on the way to being delegitimized altogether. This acts in turn as an echo chamber for Muslim prejudice, reinforcing it and fueling the sense of paranoia and victimization which is driving the terror. And it has also released the virus of Judeophobia in Britain, with the trope of the global Jewish conspiracy putting the world at risk now a staple of mainstream discourse in the media. This virulent irrationality has brought together in Britain both left and right. The left, anti-America and pro-Third World, puts the blame for Islamist terror on America, Israel, and the war in Iraq. The right, isolationist stability fetishists who think the world is full of dangerous foreigners who would leave us alone if only we don't upset them, blames America, Israel, and the war in Iraq. What all these people in Britain fail to grasp is that the Jews are indeed central to Islamist terror, but in quite the opposite way to what they think. The work of Sayyid Qutb, the principal ideologue of modern Islamism, holds that not only is the West conspiring to destroy Islam, but that the Jews are a metaphysical cosmic evil who are the puppet masters of the West. So anti-Jewishness is actually central to the jihad. That's why, in my view, Israel has such iconic status in the Islamist pantheon. In other words, Israel's fight is the West's own fight. If Israel goes down, the West goes with it. But Britain and Europe don't see it that way at all. They think Israel is the cause of the problem, a view greatly reinforced, I have to tell you, by the contributions of the Israeli left, whose revisionism and cognitive dissonance feed the venom in the British universities and media. That's why we have in Britain 1930s-style appeasement, the demonization of Israel, and resurgent anti-Jewish hatred. This, in turn, is now causing the West to falter in its defense of the free world. In Britain, America, and I believe in Israel too, we see a collapse of nerve along with a vacuum in political leadership. In Britain, a recent poll showed that most people thought President Bush was a greater threat to world peace than Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. The biggest danger to the West is the climate of defeatism, appeasement, and cultural collapse now on display for all the Islamist world to see. Since Londonistan, my book Londonistan, was published last summer, there has been a shift in British thinking. We've had various events such as the discovery of the transatlantic bomb plot, which you may have briefly read about, the suggestion that up to 12 transatlantic airliners were going to be blown up simultaneously. So that's actually focused people's minds quite a lot. The idea that the 7/7 bombers were simply a group of rather silly boys who were going in for a bit of copycat suicide bombing, you know, the way young people do, which is the kind of thing that Britons told themselves, and they were only upset because of the war in Iraq, and after all, who could disagree with that? Suddenly, the discovery of this transatlantic bomb plot with possibly hundreds and hundreds of Al-Qaeda people around the world being involved made people think that possibly their theory had a few holes in it. So there's been a bit of a shift, and there have been other things too. We actually had a debate last autumn about whether it was right for Muslim women to wear the full-face niqab veil in public places. This caused a tremendous sensation that we were actually having a debate about an Islamist practice. We all felt very brave. That was before we discovered that a prime male suspect for the murder of a police officer had walked unchallenged through Heathrow Airport and escaped to Somalia because he was wearing such a veil. Tony Blair's government has now realized that its strategy of appeasement has been a disaster, but it doesn't know what to do instead. Mr. Blair made a speech recently telling Muslims to adapt to British ways or get out. We all sat up and took notice. But then he went on to endorse multiculturalism, which he appeared to think just meant being nice to people of different backgrounds. Oh dear. So what should be done? Very simply this. We all have to grasp that terrorism is not the biggest threat we face. The biggest threat is the ideology that drives it. It's not enough to fight terror, vital though that is. The principal battleground is actually the world of ideas. The Islamists understand this extremely well. They understand that if they can hijack the human mind to the cause of hatred and lies, they have an army. And if they can further hijack the minds of their victims, they will win. In Britain, the minds of their victims are well on the way to being thus hijacked. The Islamists understand that psychological warfare, the fomenting of paranoia, of resentment, of hysteria, and demoralization, that this kind of warfare is their most effective weapon. We're not even on the same page. We haven't even understood that this is where the battleground is. If you talk about Islamist ideas, you're received with shrieks of racism, prejudice, bigotry, Islamophobia, and the debate is promptly shut down. The liberal West, which worships at the shrine of reason and makes such a fetish of the power of the intellect, does not understand that ideas can kill. As a result, Britain, Europe, America, and Israel have all left the battleground of ideas totally undefended, allowing the unhindered advance of falsehood and hatred. Worse still, our intelligentsia and media often are acting now as the Islamists' fifth column. It is only if we act against the ideology that is spreading this falsehood and this hatred and stop its advance under the convenient umbrella of minority rights that we have any chance of defending the free world adequately. That means that while we must certainly show respect to Muslims who derive spiritual sustenance from their faith, we must also reassert Western values. We must say that Muslims, like any other minority, are welcome to practice their faith and form communities of faith in our countries on the same terms that we give everyone else, which means that where their values conflict with the overarching values of the West, or of the host countries, the overarching values, freedom of speech, women's rights, monogamy, not polygamy, whatever, that those values actually win. So we have to reassert Western values, and we have to resist any attempts to subvert them. It also means facing down in public the lies spread about Israel and the West. Only if we stop deluding ourselves and take this kind of action, which is necessary for our survival, will, I suggest that it's only in this way that we will stop this sleepwalking to defeat. Thank you.